Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Education Canada, powered by VoiceEd Radio. I'm Stephen Hurley from VoiceEd Radio, and along with Max Cook and his team from the EdCan Network, we're happy to welcome you to this evening's very special conversation. Tonight, I'm coming to you from Milton, Ontario, part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee people, and today is the home to rich and vibrant communities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who live on these lands today. I would like to acknowledge that tonight's conversation is sponsored in part by Courses for Teachers from Queen's University. We appreciate their support and their willingness to help us with tonight's event. Tonight's session is being recorded, and we will let you know after what we're doing with that recording and how you might be able to access this. Tonight is the second cycle in a format that EdCan Network, in partnership with VoiceEd Radio, has sought to develop. And in this format, we seek to connect education research and practice by connecting education researchers and education practitioners. Sometimes we view, and often we view, research as flowing from the academy into the schoolhouse in kind of a unidirectional way. We know, however, that school, district, and community-based practitioners also have insights and experience that can be of benefit to scholars. To begin our conversation tonight, our scholars are going to get 3 to 4 minutes to give you their take on the question, what is our vision for student success in the aftermath of the pandemic? That's the question we're gathered around tonight, and it's the question that's drawn you here. We want to hear from them. They've all written articles for the EdCan website, Education Canada. They've all had 15-minute conversations with me on VoiceEd Radio, and you can hear the results of that and read the results of all of that, and I'm sure many of you have already done that. So you come prepared for this conversation. Part one of our discussion will end with some questions and answers from the audience. I appreciate the people that have submitted some questions ahead of time, and we've tried to work that into our conversation in this first part, but there will be a more formal question and answer towards the end of our first 40 minutes. A good number of you have also registered to participate in part two of our live discussion, and this is something new this time. So at 7:45, we're going to be moving into breakout rooms where a smaller number of you will be able to engage with one of our guest scholars around their particular perspective in a facilitated conversation. And this is going to allow you, the participants, to offer some feedback and maybe even some pushback to our scholars on that perspective, and hopefully create more of that type of multi-directional flow of insight that I spoke about earlier. To help with those facilitations, we have enlisted some of our participants, some of our registrants from today's cycle. From Nova Scotia, we have Paul Bennett. From the Yukon, Donna Miller-Fry. From Toronto, Bev Friedman. And from New Brunswick, none other than EdCan CEO Max Cook. And so depending on how those facilitated breakout rooms run, those will be your facilitators for this evening. I wanted to introduce the scholars that are due, and I'm going to switch back and see if we have all of, I'm going to check with Brigitte. Brigitte, Claire and Anne, are they in the room? Claire is here. Oh, Claire is here. Okay, good. So I get to introduce Claire Crooks first. Dr. Claire Crooks is professor and director of the Center for School Mental Health at Western University. And her research initiatives include work in the area of mental health promotion, dating violence, evaluation of school-based mindfulness, social and emotional learning programs, as well as the development and evaluation of a small group resilience program for newcomers. Dr. Kelly Gallagher Mackay is assistant professor in the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Law and Society at Wilfrid Laurier. She is really interested in her research in educational experiences and outcomes during the pandemic, and you've probably heard a lot from Kelly during this time. She's also interested in future skills and ensuring educational opportunity, law and inequality, and also the areas of public law and regulation. Dr. Ann Lopez, who hopefully will be with us, is a professor in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at OISE UT. Dr. Lopez's teaching and research focus on anti-racist decolonizing, culturally responsive, and socially just leadership in education and schooling. And last but not least, Dr. Joel Westheimer is University Research Chair in Democracy and Education at the University of Ottawa. And you've probably heard him on CBC Radio's Ottawa Morning Show as an education columnist. Dr. Westheimer's research interests include social studies education, citizenship education, social justice, politics, and education. So welcome to our participants. Welcome to our guest scholars. It's great to have you here. I see someone else. This looks like a telephone number trying to come in. That could be Dr. Lopez now. We'll see in a moment. Well, we're going to begin by offering our scholars the opportunity to summarize their viewpoint, their perspective around the question about our vision for student success in the aftermath of the pandemic. Now, I know we're not in the aftermath of the pandemic quite yet. We are anticipating that, but this is some present and some forward thinking. So, Claire Kirks, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us 3 to 4 minutes on your perspective on that question.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and apologies for giving you a little bit of a scare there. As you know, I'm definitely not in the aftermath of the pandemic. I'm quarantining in a hotel room on the road because I've been sick and somehow in my mind got the time wrong. So I'm very grateful that I saw your email and here I am. But anyway, I'm pleased to go first and try and put mental health on the table here because mental health is health. You really, we have this distinction between sort of mental health and physical health that's not very helpful. And we really need to attend to a more holistic understanding of health as we come out of this pandemic and to optimize children's well-being and success. And there's just a few sort of foundational pieces I want to put out there for this discussion. So one, you know, when we look at adults and our colleagues in the workplace, when people are struggling in the workplace, it's often mental health that gets in the way. Either, you know, like stress and mental health are the leading causes of short-term and long-term disability. And when you think of people who struggle, it's often because they have challenges with social and emotional skills, or they have trouble handling stress. And school is really no different. Children and youth won't learn optimally without those same skills around self-regulation and good connections to others. So children's mental health in Canada is not great. In my article, I noted that even pre-pandemic, the last UN report card had us listed as 31st out of 38 among 38 rich countries for children's mental health and well-being, which is a terrible ranking and not one we would accept in any other area, I would argue. And the pandemic's really made it worse, and it's made it worse in inequitable ways. So the pandemic didn't cause the children's mental health crisis in Canada, but it's accelerated it and made some of the underlying inequities much more stark. So when you're talking about the kind of numbers we're talking about and the way kids are struggling, we have to have a upstream approach of prevention and mental health promotion. You can't rely on treatment alone for a few reasons. One, we don't have the numbers of mental health professionals. It's expensive and less effective to do treatment versus early intervention and prevention. And finally, the human cost is greater because you're waiting till kids are in such crisis or distress, or they've already left school, or before you intervene. And that's obviously not the way we want to do things. We know there's lots of things that can improve mental health. We can teach children and youth signs and impacts of stress and more healthy coping strategies. We can teach them relationship skills. And schools are really well positioned to do this. Most children are there, spend a lot of their time there. We have adults who are really connected to them and know what typical behavior looks like. And so we have this opportunity, and in fact, in many ways have done this, to integrate this into the curriculum. And just 2 final caveats here. One, this is not about turning teachers into social workers. Teachers already have a big job. It's about having a comprehensive approach where every adult knows what their role is. And teachers have a role that's different from guidance counselors or administrators or social workers or psychologists, but they do have a role. And finally, when I'm talking about mental health, I'm really thankful that some of the other folks here tonight will be talking about more systems level things and structural influences, because the problem when we talk about mental health, it makes it sound very individual and like we just need to give individual students the coping strategies or resilience. And that's part of the equation. And the other part is that this all unfolds in a way where structural inequities and racism and violence also play a big role. So by emphasizing mental health, individual mental health, I'm not negating the importance of those other pieces. So thank you.
Claire, I wondered if I could just push a little further on that student success piece. So in reframing or re-envisioning or deepening our vision of student success, where in that does the mental health of students and educators fit into that?
Sure. Yeah. So at the end of the day, when children leave our school system, we want them to have the skills and strengths to the best of their ability to live the lives they want to lead and make the choices they want to make and contribute in the ways they want to contribute. And so the same way they need certain literacy and numeracy, we want them to leave with those same components of mental health and social and emotional skills so that they can, again, be engage in their own values directed and goal directed behavior. So it's not about turning everybody into something, but about them being able to make choices based on their own values and their families, their communities and cultures around what they want to do and have the skills to pursue that. And then you mentioned that teacher well-being is another huge component here, which is that we also want our educators to be able to live their best lives. And we know that teaching is stressful. The pandemic's been unreal. I have 4 children of my own, and there's times when I was trying to kind of work and kind of supervise homeschooling. And I thought, God, if can you imagine being a teacher and you have kids home trying to do their school, and then you're also trying to teach a whole classroom. And so the stress has been phenomenal. And I think we just really need to attend to that in a comprehensive and proactive way. It really is a systems issue, or else it's going to be putting out fires. And we're already seeing that in some boards where there's such high absenteeism because people are sick and tired, and so it really starts to affect the whole system because the educators and administrators who are there are just having this massive work amplification. So we really need to think about this for both students and educators.
Thank you, Claire. And Kelly, we're going to go to you for your opening remarks on an aspect of student success a little bit different.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. And I want to start by acknowledging my colleague, Christine Corso, who I worked with on the article that kind of underlies this presentation, and appreciate all the work of the organizers bringing us together today. The question of a vision for student success reminds me of a project that Christine and I and Charles Ungerleider and Linda Massey and some others who I see here worked on with People for Education over years, called Measuring What Matters. And that was a project where we argued that as schools are preparing students for a very challenging present and a frankly alarming future, we need to define both student and school success very broadly. So as an education system, we really haven't paid enough attention to important dimensions of learning and well-being, citizenship, mental and physical health, social emotional learning, and creativity. And we need to always be asking whether students are getting meaningful and equitable opportunities to develop those capacities in quality learning environments with hopefully healthy and happy educators and caring professionals around them. Measuring What Matters, however, firmly acknowledge the need for continuing attention to academic subjects, including literacy and numeracy. We were planning an add-on, not a replacement in terms of school success. And the debates that have followed from COVID-19 about what's happening with students and understanding the impact on students have sometimes been a little polarized in ways I find a bit pendulumish. We know that it's had a devastating impact on schooling in Canada and internationally. We know that educators and students have been extraordinarily adaptive in coping with this huge series of shocks. But I don't think that as a society, we've really wrestled with the long-term impact of these kinds of disruptions on student success. And nor as a society, I think that might be less true in the education community, but socially, nor have we acknowledged the extent to which the crisis of the pandemic is layered and intersects with the serious and unaddressed inequities of race, indigeneity, and social class in our education system today. So I would argue that extended school closures and ongoing permanent remote schooling options in some provinces have had a greater effect on children and youth on average than the disease itself. COVID has fundamentally shaken up children and youth's opportunities for play, to create art and community, and to develop their sense with others. And school closures have had a serious effect on academic skills, which are not limited to literacy and numeracy and include development of scientific foundations, learning about history, geography, citizenship, the package. Academic learning and attainment is a key determinant of health, income, happiness, and civic participation across the lifetime. And we have very significant disparities in these outcomes. And the more we know about the disparities, the more visible those become, especially for historically disadvantaged groups. If we don't address them, it's likely to contribute to the continuation and deepening of long-term social inequality. And particularly vulnerable in terms of the future economy and automation. I'm not going to rehash the international evidence that says that students on average had made less progress during pandemic-related school closures than they would have in normal years, and that those impacts were extremely inequitable, and that they correlate strongly with the burden of COVID-19 in terms of disease, family unemployment, stress, isolation, crowding, digital divides. All of those life factors have pushed student outcomes in disturbing ways. So my vision for student success in the wake of the pandemic, in the ongoing wake, growing wake of the pandemic, calls for significant and targeted investments in both educational recovery and reimagining. It calls for drawing on evidence-based programs, and it calls for a direction for this recovery and reimagining that brings in multiple stakeholders. And it's a little bit optimistic. There's some interest in educational innovation, doing some things different, measuring whether the things we're doing are working, so that as we do new things, and find out what would work better in the second iteration, keeping track of our own progress. So I've got two examples and then I'll stop for a while. I've done a lot of research around academic tutoring, and I would dearly love to see federal youth employment dollars go into creating a youth service corps to provide an immediate infusion of people and energy to shore up social and academic support students through tutoring and mentoring. Or I think another area that's clearly coming out of, you hear from newcomer organizations, for example, we really need to readdress the connection between schools, families, and communities. We've shut down our schools to keep them safe. How do we reopen them? So there are successful models like we've seen in Quebec's English language school communities to provide paid staff who work on community connection. They have great outcomes for students. I'd like to see stuff like that. And if we're going to look at class size reduction in the context of teacher shortages, let's look at the experience of France that showed that starting with equity deserving schools helped improve acceleration for the students who needed the support the most. Finally, I would say, and this is where I will disagree with some people, a well-informed discussion about educational needs to be informed by system-wide efforts to collect, share, and use system-level data so that we can track student progress under challenging circumstances. It shouldn't be limited to literacy and numeracy, but it should include that. Instead, we've fallen far short of the UNESCO guidelines for data collection and I would describe that as an educational failure in Canada.
Kelly, I'm wondering, of those 3 or 4 ideas that you had, which one would you really like to see implemented soon? Which one can we leverage to get I guess I don't want to say the most bang for our buck, but which one do you find most hopeful?
Well, I think that the one I wouldn't do would be class size reduction, although I know it's very popular. I think the other 2 actually can be kind of complementary if you're putting young people in schools with a mission around tutoring. And there's also potential for them to do work in terms of some of the community development sides, because right now we know that we ask for school community connections, but nobody is given time in the day to do it. And when you're teaching full time, you really don't have the time. So I wouldn't choose between those 2. Okay. I did, one of the things I cut out for length is how far behind Canada is in investing in educational recovery compared to most other countries. We are looking at an enormous problem if students don't get support in, dare I say it, catching up educationally to make sure that they're learning what they need to go on to what comes next in their lives. And we are spending peanuts to address those issues, I would say. In the US, federally alone, not counting the states who actually have the responsibility for administering education, they spent $125 billion on educational recovery. More than a year and a half ago, they made that commitment. 25 of that specifically dedicated to recovery. We haven't anteed up. There's no reason we couldn't do both tutoring and better community liaison work.
Okay. I'm going to remind our participants, our audience, that we do have some question and answer time at the end of this first part of our evening. And if you wanted to put those into the chat, any questions that are emerging already, you can do so, and we'll do our best to get to those at the end. And Brigitte, I'm not sure if, and I'll just ask out there, we're waiting and looking for signs of Dr. Ann Lopez, who is in Ghana right now, and has indicated that she would be coming in probably by cell phone. So I'm just wondering whether that cell phone number there might be Dr. Ann Lopez, but I'm not sure. So maybe we'll get a indication in the chat on that. I'm going to turn to Dr. Joel Westheimer from, well, I'm never sure whether you're in Ottawa or New York, but welcome. You had a different take on this question, a different perspective. Welcome, and let's hear from you.
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I am from New York, and I'm doing this from New York, and an enormous garbage truck just passed by my window and made an unbelievable amount of noise. So I'm really glad that it passed just before I was supposed to talk, because I was going to have to hand the baton to someone else until the garbage truck passed. But it's gone. So hopefully you can all hear me. It's great to be here, and I love this idea of this setup, and this is just, Max and all of you, just the way you pull this together, Stephen, it's a great opportunity to kind of talk between researchers and practitioners. So I'm going to just make a couple of quick points, because I know we'll have time during the discussion, but I'm going to start with that old saw that we've heard a lot now through the pandemic, which is that the pandemic served as this X-ray revealing a lot of things that we already knew were there. There was no mystery about it, right? But it brought them to the forefront. And, I'm going to mention three of them and just focus quickly on the last one. But the first was really obvious, which was massive inequality. right? Inequality in students' home situations, in their access to technology, in their access to resources, and to all kinds of things that can help them in their learning. All of us, anyone on this call, and all educators and most parents knew that these inequalities exist, but it was literally pinned in the vernacular of Zoom, right? It was pinned to our screens. I mean, teachers were literally in children's living rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, right? Some kids had huge spaces set up with their own computer and a quiet space to work. Other kids were sharing a laptop with their siblings, a parent, and people were walking, back and forth, and they couldn't have their camera on, and all of those things. So we were literally unable to turn away because it was literally on our screens, right? The inequality. And that inequality is real. And I'm sure we'll talk about, we'll come back to that in the discussion. The other has a lot to do with what Claire talked about in her comments on mental health, because let's face it, loneliness was among young people and adolescents was an epidemic before the pandemic, right? We knew the effects of social media, of phones, of all the things that have been coming out over the last 20 years, the current situation and the situations we have put children in for the last 20 years of both school reform and all kinds of other reform in society have created an epidemic of loneliness and sense of lack of meaning, lack of connection to other people. So it was a problem before the pandemic. It became an even greater problem during the pandemic. And I think it's obviously still going to be there after the pandemic. And so I really think that what Claire alluded to is extremely important. We obviously have to attend to not just the relationship needs, but the mental health needs of students, their connections with other people, and the way they interact there. The third one, though, is the one that I focused on in my piece, and that is the overburdened curriculum, right? The X-ray of the pandemic again showed us what we already knew, which is that we have an obsessive focus on content. On coverage over content, right? That for decades now, it's not that we believe that certain content matters or that kids don't need to know something. It's just that we knew that kids don't need to know everything, right? We live in an age of infinitely accessible information, and our problem is not a dearth of information, but too much information. And we need to teach kids the skills of how to deal with and parse that information and make it meaningful to themselves. This less is more kind of aphorism has been around for a long, long time, but we really saw it in the pandemic. And this is why I've been railing against, as much as I can, the use of the term learning loss. Like, look, I'm not saying that kids didn't learn as much as they would have learned if there was no pandemic. About 1.7 billion students were out of school for months and months at a time. Okay, we don't need a test regimen to tell us that those 1.7 billion students who had 9 months less of schooling than their previous cohorts have learned less content than their previous cohorts, right? That is just an absurd research obsession to find out what we already know and flaunt it in the face of those children who are behind. There are basic skills that kids are going to need and that will have to be circled back to catch up, and we should devote resources to those. But our obsession with this idea of learning loss simply reinforces the idea that coverage is what's important, not content, right? It doesn't matter if they've read this particular book. What matters is that they've read a book, engaged in it intellectually, and been able to connect with one another. So quickly, the way I think that we need to orient ourselves going forward is to come back to something that I know is important to so many of us, which is the centrality of relationship in education. I think that education is relationship. It's always been relationship. And so we need to use this opportunity of a kind of rethinking of the way we do things to focus our efforts on emphasizing relationships in the classroom. That means looking at student well-being and mental health. It means looking at students' connections with one another and the ways that classrooms enable or inhibit those connections. And of course, with their teachers. And that, of course, also means, as a couple of people already said, the looking at the working and living conditions of teachers in schools, because if they are responsible for fostering those healthy relationships in community, then they need to be able to enjoy healthy working and professional relationships themselves. I spent a lot of the pandemic saying, like so many people, this is an opportunity. Everything's, there's a possibility here, right? Everything is changing and we can recast the way we think about things. But unfortunately, I'd say what we've learned is that opportunity is not the same as destiny. And it is very unclear. We are teetering on the edge of some kind of stalwart sticking with the idea that we can reshape things. But much too much going back to business as usual. And that business as usual is a kind of tautological obsession. I want to just, this is the last thing I'll say, explain what I mean by tautological. A tautological obsession with people who want to insist that coverage, not content, is the most important thing in a curriculum, and then give standardized tests to find out whether we've reached that coverage. All right, you can't say coverage is important, and I'm going to test you on that coverage, and then use the results of those tests to say, you see, coverage is important, right? The tests only test coverage. They don't test content, right? Teachers know about content because content requires drawing on the passions and interests and experiences of the teacher and students in their classrooms and schools to build meaningful learning environments that emphasize relationship, connect kids to one another, and develop their thinking around specific forms of content.
So at first blush, it may seem like our scholars disagree with each other or have points of contention with each other, but maybe not. And so I wanted to go back to Claire. Claire, is there anything that you connected with from Joel or Kelly that maybe you could bring forward to?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here doing the big nodding for sure.
Yeah, I saw that.
I just, Joel's point about relationships and the relational nature of education is so important. And I would just extend that to say that it also shows why teacher well-being is critical, because so much of that is that relationship. And there's research showing that stress is literally contagious, right? And there's a big kerfuffle over whether we can call something like mental health a pandemic. There's not a viral vector, but we do know stress is contagious. And there's this very elegant study that shows that kindergarten teachers' self-reported stress levels are actually associated with the cortisol response in their kindergarten students, which means like that stress is actually triggering a stress response, the teacher stress. And the flip side of that, of course, is much of how people develop, much of how children's brain does develop and their own capacities develop is through a process of co-regulation, often with the adults around them, peers as well, but adults. And so the flip side of stress contagion is that an adult who can sit with a child and do that co-regulation when they're having big feelings, they can, as a child's kind of arousal or upset goes up, that the educator can become more calm and can really create meaningful learning. And neuroscience is behind us on this one. This isn't just good teaching practice. But for educators to be able to do that, like you can't just tell a whole lot of really overworked, overstressed people to, look past the children's misbehavior and just try and be calm. As parents, we try to tell ourselves that. So we really need to create the conditions and supports for them to be able to do that. And then Kelly's point, the need for surveillance data. I'm 100% in that boat as well. That it's that we measure what matters and what matters gets measured, and so we do need to have better data. And I saw the question about, is it just because of sort of provincial versus federal jurisdiction? I don't think it's just that. And I'll certainly, Kelly studies this more closely, But we're in Canada, we're kind of lousy on surveillance data, especially child and youth surveillance data. And there's all kinds of examples in the States, even when they have this dual jurisdiction, of ways that children's well-being and health, it gets done as an ongoing surveillance through the Center for Disease Control or other bodies. And in Canada, it tends to be driven by grant-funded projects that are quite time limited. So you have a couple of waves of data where you can kind of look at trends. We do have the health behavior of school-age children data, but that's cross-sectional, but at least that's international. It can show us, for example, that, yeah, we continue to spin our wheels on things like children's loneliness and bullying. And with the lack of a federally coordinated strategy, we don't make a lot of grounds in those areas. But that's so I think just some really important points from both panelists.
Kelly, I wanted to go to you for reaction or response or a point of connection, perhaps.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, when I listen to us, I hear 90-some% agreement and some degrees of tension. I think one of the things we do care about schooling and that we do need to continue to care about is knowledge, but that doesn't mean checking every box on an exhaustive curriculum that it's easier to add to than take things out of. I do actually think that one of the ways that it's easier to make sense of the excess of information in the world is if you have kind of critical and intellectual frameworks. And I think you need to learn some content. Didn't get any physics in grade 10 because she wasn't sure she was going to do it in upper years. Like, it's not a checklist in that sense. I'm fine with her having read less of certain things in her English class, but she didn't get any physics because we were just too busy, too stressed, too much was going on. And I think that matters, so I want to say that it's one thing to say students need to learn everything, but I think we do know how to reasonably test core skills. I don't think it's the end of the world to test the skills. And I think it can be stressful to write tests where there's comparability and comparison happening. And I think we've done incredibly unproductive and dangerous things with them in the past. But nonetheless, the fact that we have not had data on what's been happening in our schools, and it's not just test data. We haven't had attendance data at the provincial level, accumulation data at the provincial level, which is the single most predictive thing of whether kids will go on to PSE. We haven't had all kinds of data. It's just been a void. And without that data, I think that's part of, it's not all of. The other thing is maybe a lack of imagination about what we do with things, and maybe a little worry that nothing ever works or changes in education. Like, it's complicated why we haven't had a strong educational response. But I think that part of it is that we haven't taken a look at our kids. And I was certainly told by a very senior official, oh, well, all this international data saying kids are doing so badly, I don't think we know that that applies here in Ontario because, we've done a really good job with our online learning. Well, come on. If you're able to use it as a point of denial, I think that's a problem too. So I will say that I totally think social emotional learning is essential. I totally think physical health is essential too. And we haven't had nearly enough physical activity going on in our schools ever. But I also think schools are a place where we should still fight for knowledge mattering, even if it's not the details of the War of 1812. It matters.
Joel, in a final, and we're going to move into some breakout rooms in a few moments. One of the big questions that emerged as participants, the audience got ready for this was, and Dave Cormier of the University of Windsor made this point today. Everything we're talking about here, whether it's mental health and wellness, whether it's the content, whether it's the skills, whether it's the measurement, all of this is already inscribed in our official curricula right across Canada. Yet we're still talking about the need to attend to this and to expand our notion of student success, to capture things that are already written into the, how do we get started in this? How do we change the way we talk about it? Do you have any ideas on that?
Were you directing that towards me?
Yeah, too, Joel.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the paradigm, Kelly and I agree on almost everything there, that, content matters. It's just that they don't have to focus on all content, right? But I think that you hit the nail on the head, Stephen, is that it's what we've been looking at is sort of the wrong paradigm for success, right? This idea that individualized knowledge and skills are the end goal instead of a means to develop students' best selves within the community of their teachers and peers. And so if we had a paradigm where schooling, for example, was about figuring out your connection to others and to the broader community and how you can have a meaningful place in that community, then the other stuff, the content and stuff would fall under there. The problem is when we have the sort of content tail or the coverage tail wagging the school reform dog, right? And we lose track of the thing that all teachers know, that education is about relationships. All teachers are, hindered or enabled to focus on relationships with their students. But we know from research and we know from common sense that it's about that relationship with students. And I think it's changing that paradigm of individual success through mastery of content, knowledge, and skills only that matters, or that is the end point instead of the means to something bigger. That's what we have to focus on.
And this links back to our initial conversation in the fall on how we will teach, or how will we teach in a post-pandemic Canada. And I see Christina Llewellyn's in the room, and she spoke very articulately and passionately about the fact of relationships and how that undergirds and supports everything. I'm going to go to Shanice. I'm conscious of the time and that we have a second part to this. Shanice, any questions from the audience? And you can actually voice them if you want to bring a couple forward just in the last few minutes. Okay, so Maria Schwab is a teacher out in Vancouver. For Claire, what does research... Oh, it's going by there. What does research say about why Canada rates so poorly in terms of student mental health?
Yeah, so again, to Kelly's point, it's hard to answer that when we don't have good, and when I say surveillance data, what I mean by that is just data that over time looks at the same kinds of variables or measures. You can look at changes as opposed to these sort of one-off studies or cross-sectional time. And I just want to clarify that, because surveillance data also sounds, a little scary when we're all always warned about sharing passwords and whatnot. I think that there's no one factor that people, that some of these things that existed way before the pandemic, like loneliness, like disconnection, like the role of social media and technology, which even there may be some gender differences. And again, no one of these things operates in a vacuum. They all intersect and interact with each other. I think the increased sense of competition and stress for families who worry about their kids having advantage as we see the larger economy changing and that increasing worry of, are my children going to be able to afford a house someday, or that it also kind of amps up pressure on students and sometimes contributes to parenting behaviors that aren't as helpful in the long term in trying to kind of protect and motivate and support their own kids. But I think part of it too, so there's all those pieces, and part of it is we just haven't had a comprehensive strategy, that we actually need all levels of government to come together, because everyone has a different role. And again, it's not just the education sector. So we need protocols so that when somebody is struggling, that there's a really clear path and clear guidelines around what schools are responsible for. So in Ontario, School Mental Health Ontario has done a really nice job trying to identify these pathways where certain types of things happen in the school. And then there's a point at which you recognize that you should be transitioning to services in the community because it's beyond what schools can handle, the needs of the student. The reality is we have a huge shortage then of community-based mental health services, very little attention, frankly, to evidence-based approaches in community mental health. Services aren't accessible. There's this huge wait list. So again, if we had this comprehensive approach and thinking back to what Kelly was saying, that this community education partnership would be a really great place to look at that. So we're not duplicating services and initiatives and we're looking for gaps, but ideally, for children who are and youth who are maybe a bit reluctant about mental health services, when they're ready, you want that door to be open then. You don't want to tell somebody who's seeking help, a 14-year-old, actually come back in 6 months. That's our wait list. And when you do come, here's the 3 buses you have to take across town. And oh, sorry, we don't actually have anyone that can communicate with your parents in their language. So you'll have to sort that out. Like it's not good enough. So I don't think there's any one reason. And again, lots of these things predate the pandemic and people have been sounding the alarm for years. The pandemic just brought it into sharper focus.
Thank you. And okay, Kelly, go ahead.
I guess the other thing I would add in a yes and sense, I completely agree with all of that. And, it's been clear from educators that this has been a huge issue for a really long time. I want to make the case that actually learning and mastery is a really important part of positive mental health, that inequities in our learning are contributing to greater stresses, so that it's kind of a two-way process. So I think that it is really critical that we think about ways of keeping track of how kids are doing and tying it back together, not letting the pendulum swing. We definitely went too far on the only thing that matters are test scores in 2 subjects. That was definitely a period of too much. It's really great to hear the attention on well-being and the social learning and the relationships mattering. It's really critical, I think, from an equity perspective, that we try and keep talking about how does well-being include academic achievement, even fairly conventionally defined, and that we keep expecting that for all students, and that we don't get to a point, and I've heard this a lot more times than I'd like to have heard, we don't get to a point that we're saying they're so stressed they can't learn, or those kinds of things that have really contributed to low expectations and fairly pernicious patterns, particularly for disadvantaged students over time. So we have to keep talking about how these things fit together. It's not an either or.
Right.
Stephen, can I just add a really clear example of that, or do you want to move us into groups?
Well, we do need to move into groups.
Okay.
But maybe you could bring that to your group.
Sure.
I would just love to stay here and talk to all of you, but we have an audience here. We have participants here who are anxious to speak with you as well. And we have, this is the time we're going to move people into breakout rooms. If you are not joining us for the breakout rooms, if you've chosen to go and watch the provincial debate here in Ontario, or do something else, that's fine. We would love to thank you, and just know that the questions that have been appearing in the chat will be recorded, and we're going to use them as a way to continue this conversation. We wanted to thank all of our guest scholars, Joel Westheimer, Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, and Claire Crooks, and also Ann Lopez, who brought a perspective of anti-racism and what happens when we actually decide to listen to what students' experience of school is during this time. And hopefully we'll get her on at some other point. We would like to thank Queen's University and Courses for Teachers for their support of this event and this initiative.